Swann's Way, Combray 2, Part 7. At the hour when I usually went downstairs to find out what there was for dinner, its preparation would have already begun. And Françoise, a colonel with all the forces of nature for her subalterns, as in the fairy tales where giants hired themselves out as cooks, would be stirring the coals, putting the potatoes to steam, and at the right moment, finishing over the fire those culinary masterpieces that had first gotten ready in some of the great array of vessels, triumphs of the potter's craft, which ranged from rubs and boilers and cauldrons and fish kettles, down to jars for game, molds for pastry, and tiny cups for custard, and included an entire collection of pots and pans of every shape and size. I would stop by the table where the kitchen maid had shelved them, to inspect the platoons of peas, drawn up in ranks and numbered, like little green marbles ready for a game. But what delighted me would be the asparagus, tinged with ultramarine and rosy pink, which ran from their heads, finely stippled in mauve and azure, through a series of imperceptible changes to their white feet, still stained a little by the soil of the garden bed, an iridescence that was not of this world. I felt that these celestial hues indicated the presence of exquisite creatures who had been pleased to metamorphose into vegetables, and who, through the disguise that covered their firm and edible flesh, allowed me to discern in this radiance of earliest dawn, these hinted rainbows, these blue evening shades, that precious quality that I would recognize again when all night long after dinner at which I had eaten them, they played in their lyrical and coarse farces, as do fairies in a Shakespeare play, at transforming my chamber pot into a vase of perfume. Poor Giotto's Charity, as Swann had named her, charged by Françoise with the task of plucking them, would have them lying beside her in a basket, sitting with a mournful air, as though all the sorrows of the world were heaped on her, and the light crowns of azure that capped the asparagus shoots above their pink tunics would be finely outlined, star by star, as in Giotto's fresco. The flowers are banded about the brows or patterning the basket of his Virtue of Padua. And meantime Françoise would be turning on the spit one of those chickens, such as she alone knew how to roast, chickens that had wafted far abroad from Combray the sweet savor of her merits, and which, while she was serving them to us at table, would make the quality of kindness predominate for the moment in my private conception of her character, the aroma of that cooked flesh, which she knew how to make so unctuous and so tender, seeming to me no more than the proper perfume of one of her many virtues. But the day on which, while my father took counsel with the family about our strange meeting with La Grandane, I went down to the kitchen, was one of those days when Giotto's Charity, still very weak and ill after her recent confinement, had been unable to rise from her bed. Françoise, being without assistance, had fallen behind in her tasks. When I went down, she was in the back kitchen that opened onto the courtyard, in the process of killing a chicken, which, by its desperate and quite natural resistance, which Françoise, beside herself with rage as she attempted to slit its throat beneath the ear, accompanied with cries of "Filthy creature! Filthy creature!" made the saintly kindness and unction of our servant rather less prominent than it would do next day at dinner, when it made its appearance in a skin gold-embroidered like a chasuble, and its precious juice was poured out drop by drop as from a chalice. When it was dead, Françoise mopped up its blood, which flowed without drowning her rancor, for she gave vent to another burst of rage, and gazing down at the carcass of her enemy, uttered a final "filthy creature." I went back upstairs, trembling all over. I wanted Françoise to be dismissed then and there, But who would have brought me such hot water bottles, boiled me such fragrant coffee, and even roasted me such chickens? As it happened, everyone else had already had to make the same cowardly reckoning. For my Aunt Léonie knew, though I was still in ignorance of this, that Françoise, who, for her own daughter or for her nephews, would have given her life without a murmur, showed a singular harshness in her dealings with the rest of the world. In spite of which my aunt still retained her, for, while conscious of her cruelty, she could appreciate her services. I began gradually to realize that Françoise's kindness, her compunction, her virtues concealed many of these back-kitchen tragedies, just as history reveals to us that the reigns of the kings and queens who are portrayed as kneeling with clasped hands in the windows of churches were stained by oppression and bloodshed. I had noticed that, apart from her own kinfolk, the sufferings of humanity inspired in her a pity that increased in direct ratio to the distance separating the sufferers from herself. The torrents of tears that poured from her eyes when she read of the misfortunes of persons unknown to her in a newspaper dried up quickly once she had been able to form a more accurate mental picture of the victims. One night, shortly after her confinement, the kitchen maid was seized with the most appalling pains. Mamma heard her groans and rose and awakened Françoise, who, quite unmoved, declared that all those screams were merely a farce, that the girl wanted to play the mistress in the house. The doctor, who had been afraid of some such attack, had left a marker in a medical dictionary we had at the page on which the symptoms were described, and had told us to refer to this passage, where we would find indicated the first aid to be given. My mother sent Françoise to fetch the book, warning her not to let the marker drop out. An hour elapsed, and Françoise had not returned. My mother, supposing that she had gone back to bed, grew vexed and told me to go to the library. I did so, and there I found Françoise, who, in her curiosity to know what the marker indicated, had begun to read the clinical account of these after-pains and was violently sobbing, now that it was a question of a type of illness with which she was not familiar. At each painful symptom mentioned by the author of the article, she would exclaim, "Oh, Holy Virgin, is it possible that the good Lord wishes to make a wretched human being suffer so? Oh, the poor girl!" But when I called her, and she had returned to the bedside of Giotto's charity, her tears at once ceased to flow. She could find no stimulus for that pleasant sensation of tenderness and pity, which she knew very well, having been moved to it often enough by reading newspapers, nor any other pleasure of the same kind in her sense of weariness and irritation at being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night for the kitchen maid, so that at the sight of those very sufferings, the printed account of which had moved her to tears, she had nothing to offer but ill-tempered mutterings, mingled with bitter sarcasm, saying when she thought that we had gone out of earshot, "Well, she never need have done what she must have done to bring all this about. She found that pleasant enough, I dare say. She had better not put on any airs now. All the same, he must have been a God-forsaken young man to go after that. Ah, it's just as they used to say in my poor mother's country dialect. Snaps and snails and puppy dogs' tails and dirty sluts and plenty smell sweeter than roses in young men's noses when the heart is 1 in 20. Although when her grandson had a slight head cold, she would set off at night, even if she were ill, instead of going to bed, to see whether he had everything that he wanted, covering 10 miles on foot before daybreak so as to be in time to begin her work. On the other hand, this same love for her own people and her desire to establish the future greatness of her house on a solid foundation was transformed in her policy with regard to other servants into one unvarying maxim, which was never to let any of them set foot in my aunt's room. Indeed, she showed a sort of pride in not allowing anyone else to come near my aunt, preferring, when she was ill, to get out of bed and to administer the Vichy water in person, rather than to concede to the kitchen maid the right of entry into her mistress's presence. There's a species of Hymenoptera observed by Fabre, the burrowing wasp, which, in order to provide a supply of fresh meat for her offspring after her own death, calls in the science of anatomy to amplify her cruelty, and having captured weevils and spiders, proceeds with marvelous knowledge and skill to pierce the nerve center on which their power of locomotion, but none of their other vital functions, depends, so that the paralyzed insect beside which her eggs are laid will furnish the larva, when it is hatched, with a tamed and inoffensive quarry, incapable either of flight or of resistance, but perfectly fresh for the larder. In the same way, Françoise had adopted to minister to her permanent and unfaltering resolution to render the household uninhabitable to any other servant a series of crafty and pitiless stratagems. Many years later, we discovered that if we had been fed asparagus day after day throughout that summer, it was because their odor gave the poor kitchen maid who had to prepare them such violent attack of asthma that she was finally obliged to leave my aunt's service. Alas, we had definitely to alter our opinion of Monsieur Legrandin. On one of the Sundays following our meeting with him, on the Pont Vieux, after my father had been forced to confess himself mistaken, as Mass drew to an end, and with the sunshine and the noise of the outer world, something else invaded the church. An atmosphere so far from sacred that Madame Goupil, Madame Papessier, all those, in fact, who a moment earlier, when I arrived a little late, had been sitting motionless, their eyes fixed on their prayer books, who, I might even have thought, had not seen me come in, had not their feet moved slightly to push away the little prayer bench that was preventing me from getting to my seat, began in loud voices to discuss with us all manner of utterly mundane topics, as though we were already outside in the square. We saw, standing on the sun-baked steps of the porch, dominating the many-colored tumult of the market, Legrandin himself, whom the husband of the lady we had seen him with on the previous occasion was just going to introduce to the wife of another large landowner of the district. Legrandin's face showed an extraordinary zeal and animation. He made a deep bow with a secondary backward movement that brought his back sharply up into a position behind its starting point, a gesture he must have learned from the husband of his sister, Madame de Combray. This rapid recovery caused a sort of tense muscular wave to ripple over Legrandin's rump, which I had not supposed to be so fleshy. I cannot say why, but this undulation of pure matter, this wholly carnal flow, with not the least hint of it a spirituality, this wave lashed to a fury by the wind of an obsequiousness of the basest sort, awoke my mind suddenly to the possibility of a Legrandin altogether different from the one whom we knew. The lady gave him some message from her coachman, and while he walked to her carriage, the impression of joy, timid and devoted, which the introduction had stamped there, still lingered on his face. Carried away in a sort of dream, he smiled. Then he began to hurry back toward the lady, and as he was walking faster than usual, and his shoulders swayed right and left in the most absurd fashion, and he looked so utterly had he abandoned himself to it, ignoring all other considerations, as though he were the lifeless mechanical toy of his own happiness. Meanwhile, we were coming out through the porch. We were passing close behind him. He was too well bred to turn his head, but he fixed his eyes, which were suddenly lost in profound reverie, on so distant a point of the horizon that he could not see us, and so had not to acknowledge our presence. His face retained an air of innocence above his straight and supple coat, which looked as though conscious of having been led astray, in spite of itself, in the midst of detested splendor. And a polka-dotted necktie, stirred by the breezes of the square, continued to float in front of Legrandin, like the standard of his proud isolation, of his noble independence. Just as we reached the house, my mother discovered that we had forgotten the Saint Honoré, and asked my father to go back with me and tell them to send it up at once. Near the church, we met Legrandin, coming toward us with the same lady, whom he was escorting to her carriage. He brushed past us and did not interrupt what he was saying to her, but gave us, out of the corner of his blue eye, a little sign, which began and ended, so to speak, inside his eyelids. And as it did not involve the least movement of his facial muscles, managed to pass quite unperceived by the lady. But striving to compensate by the intensity of his feelings for the somewhat restricted field in which they had to find expression, he made that blue chink, which was set apart for us, sparkle with all the animation of cordiality, which went far beyond mere playfulness and almost bordered on mischievousness. He subtlized the refineries of amiability into winks of connivance, hints, innuendos, all the mysteries of complicity in a plot, and finally exalted his assurances of friendship to the level of protestations of affection, even of a declaration of love, lighting up for us and for us alone, with a secret languor invisible to the chatelaine by his side, an enamored eye in a face of ice. Only the day before, he had asked my parents to send me to dine with him on this same Sunday evening. "Come and keep your elderly friend company," he had said to me. "Like the bouquet that a traveler sends us from some land to which we will never return. Come, and let me breathe from the far country of your adolescence the scent of those flowers of spring, among which I used to wander many years ago. Come with the primrose, with the canon's beard, with the gold cup. Come with the stone crop, of which pledges of love are made in the Balzacian flora. Come with the flower of the resurrection morning, the Easter daisy. Come with the snowballs of the Guelder rose, which begin to embalm with their fragrance the alleys of your great-aunt's garden, when the last mounds of snow from the Easter showers are not yet melted. Come with the glorious silken raiment of the lily, apparel fit for Solomon, and with the polychrome enamel of the pansies, but come above all with the spring breeze still cooled by the late frosts of winter, wafting apart for the last 2 butterflies who since morning have waited outside the closed portals of the first Jerusalem rose. The question was raised at home whether, all things considered, I ought still to be sent to dine with Monsieur Legrandin, but my grandmother refused to believe that he could have been impolite. "You admit yourself that he appears at church in his simple attire, which is hardly that of a man of fashion." She added that, in any event, even if at the worst he had been rude, it was far better for us to pretend we had noticed nothing. And indeed, my father himself, though more annoyed than any of us by the attitude that Legrandin had adopted, may still have held in reserve a final uncertainty as to its true meaning. It was like every attitude or action that reveals a man's deep and hidden character. They bear no relation to what he has previously said, and we cannot confirm our suspicions by the culprit's testimony, for he will admit nothing. We are reduced to the evidence of our own senses, and we ask ourselves, in the face of this detached and incoherent fragment of recollection, whether indeed our senses have not been the victims of an illusion. With the result that such attitudes, the only ones of importance in indicating character, are the most apt to leave us perplexed. I dined with Legrandin on his terrace. The moon was shining. "There is a charming quality, is there not," he said to me, "in this silence. For hearts that are wounded as mine is, a novelist whom you will read in time to come claims that there is no remedy but silence and shadow. And you see, my boy, there comes in all lives a time toward which you still have far to go, when the weary eyes can endure but one kind of light, the light that a fine evening like this prepares and distills for us in the darkness, when the ears can listen to no music save what the moonlight plays on the flute of silence." I listened to what Monsieur Legrandin was saying, which, like everything that he said, sounded attractive, but I was troubled by the memory of a lady whom I had seen recently for the first time, and thinking, now that I knew that Legrandin was on friendly terms with several members of the local aristocracy, that perhaps he knew her also, I summoned up all my courage and said to him, Do you, sir, by any chance know the ladies of Guermantes? And I felt happy, too, because in pronouncing the name, I had secured a sort of power over it, by the mere act of drawing it out of my dreams and giving it an objective existence in the world of spoken things. But at the sound of the word Guermantes, I saw in the middle of each of our friend's blue eyes a little brown dimple appear, as though they had been pierced by some invisible pin, while the rest of his pupils reacted by secreting floods of azure. The rings around his eyelids darkened and drooped. His mouth, marked with a bitter crease, was the first to recover, and smiled while his eyes still seemed full of pain, like the eyes of a good-looking martyr, whose body bristles with arrows. "No, I do not know them," he said. But instead of uttering so simple a piece of information, a reply in which there was so little that could astonish me in the natural and conversational tone that befitted it, he recited it with a separate stress on each word, leaning forward, bowing his head, with at once the vehemence that a man gives so as to be believed, to a highly improbable statement, as though the fact that he did not know the Guermantes could be due only to some strange accident of fortune, and also with the emphasis of a man who, finding himself unable to keep silent about what is to him a painful situation, chooses to proclaim it aloud, so as to convince his hearers that the confession he is making is one that causes him no embarrassment, but is easy, agreeable, spontaneous, that the situation in question, in this case the absence of relations with the Guermantes family, might very well have been not forced on, but actually desired by Legrandin himself, might arise from some family tradition, some moral principle or mystical vow that expressly forbade his knowing the Guermantes. "No," he resumed, explaining by his words the tone in which they were uttered. "No, I do not know them. I have never wished to know them. I have always made a point of preserving complete independence at heart. As you know, I am a bit of a radical. People are always coming to me about it, telling me I am mistaken in not going to Guermantes, but I make myself seem ill-bred, an old bear. That's not the sort of reputation that can frighten me. It's too true. In my heart of hearts, I care for nothing in the world now but a few churches, 2 or 3 books, only a few more paintings than books, and the light of the moon, when the fresh breeze of your youth wafts to me the scent of gardens whose flowers my old eyes are no longer sharp enough to distinguish." I did not understand very clearly why, in order to refrain from going to the houses of people whom one did not know, it would be necessary to cling to one's independence, nor how that could give one the appearance of a savage or a bear. But what did I understand? But what I did understand was this: that Legrandin was not altogether truthful when he said that he cared only for churches, moonlight, and youth. He cared a great deal for people who lived in castles, and would be so much afraid when in their company of incurring their displeasure that he would never dare to let them see that he numbered as well among his friends middle-class people, the families of solicitors and stockbrokers, preferring, if the truth must be known, that it would be revealed in his absence when he was out of earshot, and by default. He was a snob. Of course, he would never have admitted all or any of this in the poetical language that my family and I so admired. And if I asked him, "Do you really know the Guermantes family?" Legrandin the talker would reply, "No, I have never cared to know them." But unfortunately, the talker was now subordinated to another Legrandin, whom he kept carefully hidden in his breast, whom he would never consciously exhibit, because this other could tell compromising stories about our own Legrandin and about his snobbishness. And this other Legrandin had replied to me already in that wounded look, that stiffened smile, the undue gravity of the tone of his answer, in the 1,000 arrows by which our own Legrandin had instantaneously been stabbed and sickened like a Saint Sebastian of snobbery. "Oh, how you hurt me! No, I do not know the Guermantes family. Do not remind me of the great sorrow of my life." And since this other, this Legrandin enfant terrible, this Legrandin the blackmailer, if he lacked the charming manner of speaking, showed an infinitely greater promptness in expressing himself, composed of what are called reflexes, it followed that when Legrandin the talker attempted to silence him, he would already have spoken, and it would be useless for our friend to deplore the bad impression that the revelations of his alter ego must have caused, since he could do no more now than endeavor to mitigate them. And certainly this was not to say that Monsieur Legrandin was anything but sincere when he railed against snobs. He could not, from his own knowledge at least, be aware that he was also one, since it is only with the passions of others that we are ever really familiar, and what we come to find out about our own can be no more than what other people have shown us. Upon ourselves our passions react, but indirectly, through our imagination, which substitutes for our primary motives other secondary motives that are more decent. Never had Legrandin's snobbishness impelled him to make a habit of visiting a duchess as such. Instead, it would have set his imagination to make that duchess appear, in Legrandin's eyes, endowed with all the graces. He would be drawn toward the duchess, assuring himself the while that he was yielding to the attractions of her mind and her other virtues, which the vile race of snobs could never understand. Only his fellow snobs knew that he was of their number. For owing to their inability to appreciate the intervening efforts of his imagination, they saw in close juxtaposition the social activities of Legrandin and their primary cause. Now, at home, we no longer had any illusions about Monsieur Legrandin, and our relations with him had become much more distant. Mamma would be greatly delighted whenever she caught him red-handed in the sin which he continued to call the unpardonable sin of snobbery. As for my father, he found it difficult to take Legrandin's disdainful behavior in so light, in so detached a spirit. And when there was some talk one year of sending me to spend the long summer holidays at Balbec with my grandmother, he said, "I must most certainly tell Legrandin you are going to Balbec to see whether he will offer you an introduction to his sister. He probably doesn't remember telling us that she lived within a mile of the place." My grandmother, who held that when one went to the seaside one ought to be on the beach from morning to night, to taste the salt breezes, and that one should not know anyone in the place because visits and excursions were so much time stolen from the sea air, begged him on no account to speak to Legrandin of our plans, for already in her mind's eye she could see his sister alighting from her carriage at the door of our hotel just as we were on the point of going out fishing, and obliging us to remain indoors all afternoon to entertain her. But Mamma laughed at her fears, for she felt herself that the danger was not so threatening, and that Legrandin would not be so eager to make us acquainted with his sister. And, as it happened, there was no need for any of us to introduce the subject of Balbec, for it was Legrandin himself, who, without the least suspicion that we had ever had any intention of visiting those parts, walked into the trap uninvited one evening, when we met him strolling on the banks of the Vivonne. "There are tints in the clouds this evening, violets and blues, which are very beautiful. Are they not, my friend?" he said to my father. "Especially a blue that is far more floral than atmospheric. A cineraria blue, which it is surprising to see in the sky. And that little pink cloud there, has it not the tint of some flower, a carnation or hydrangea? Nowhere, perhaps, except on the shores of the English Channel, where Normandy merges into Brittany, have I been able to find such copious examples of what you might call a vegetable kingdom in the clouds. Down there, close to Balbac, among all those places that still grow wild, there is a little bay charmingly quiet, where the sunsets of the Auge Valley, those red and gold sunsets, which all the same I am very far from despising, seem commonplace and insignificant. But in that moist and gentle atmosphere, these celestial bouquets, blue and pink, will break into blossom. In a few moments in the evenings, incomparably lovely and often lasting for hours before they fade. Others shed their leaves at once, and then it is more beautiful still to see the sky strewn with the scattering of their innumerable petals, yellow and pink. In that bay called Opal, the golden sands appear more charming still from being fastened, like blonde Andromedas, to those terrible rocks of the surrounding coast, to that funereal shore, famed for the number of its wrecks, where every winter many vessels fall victim to the perils of the sea. Balbac, the oldest bone in the geological skeleton that underlies our soil, the true armor, the sea, the land's end, the accursed region that Anatole France, an enchanter whose works our young friend ought to read, has so well depicted beneath its eternal fogs, as though the true land of the Cimmerians in the Odyssey. From Balbac above all, where they are already building hotels, superimposing them on its ancient and charming soil without altering it, how delightful it is to be able to step out at once into regions so primitive and so beautiful. Indeed. And do you know anyone at Balbac? Inquired my father. This young man is going to spend a couple of months there with his grandmother, and my wife too, perhaps. Legrandin, taken unawares by the question at a moment when he was looking directly at my father, was unable to turn aside his gaze, and so concentrated it with steadily increasing intensity, smiling mournfully the while on the eyes of his questioner, with an air of friendliness and frankness, and of not being afraid to look him in the face, until he seemed to have penetrated my father's skull, as if it had been transparent, and to be seeing at the moment a long way beyond and behind it a brightly colored cloud which provided him with a mental alibi and would enable him to establish the theory that just when he was being asked whether he knew anyone at Balbac, he had been thinking of something else and so had not heard the question. As a rule, these tactics make the questioner proceed to ask, "Why, what are you thinking about?" But my father, inquisitive, annoyed, and cruel, repeated, "Have you friends, then, in that neighborhood, since you know Balbac so well?" In a final and desperate effort, the smiling gaze of Legrandin reached the extreme limits of its tenderness, vagueness, candor, and distraction. Then, feeling no doubt that there was nothing left but to answer, he said to us, "I have friends all the world over, wherever there are companies of trees, stricken but not defeated, which have come together to offer a common supplication with pathetic obstinacy to an inclement sky that has no mercy on them." "That is not quite what I mean," interrupted my father. "Obstinate as a tree and merciless as the sky. I asked you in case anything should happen to my mother-in-law, and she wanted to feel that she was not all alone down there, at the ends of the earth, whether you knew any of the people." "There as elsewhere, I know everyone, and I know no one," replied Legrandin, who was by no means ready to surrender. "The places I know well, people very slightly, but the places themselves seem to me just like people, rare and wonderful people, of a delicate quality, and whom life has disappointed. Sometimes it's a small castle that you can encounter on the cliff's edge, by the roadside where it has halted to contemplate its sorrows before an evening sky, still pink, through which climbs a golden moon of which the homeward-bound fishing boats, creasing the shimmering water, hoist its pennant at their mastheads and carry its color. Sometimes it's a simple house that stands alone, rather ugly, timid-seeming, but full of romance, hiding from every eye some imperishable secret of happiness and disenchantment. That land which knows not truth, he continued with Machiavellian subtlety, that land of infinite fiction makes bad reading for any boy, and is certainly not what I would choose or recommend for my young friend here, who is already so much inclined to melancholy, for his heart that is already predisposed to receiving its impressions. Climates that breathe amorous secrets and futile regrets may agree with an old and disillusioned man like myself, but they are always unhealthy to a temperament that is still unformed. Believe me, he went on with emphasis, the waters of that bay, more Breton than Norman, may exert a sedative influence, though even that is of questionable value on a heart which, like mine, is no longer unbroken, a heart for whose wounds there is no longer anything to compensate. But at your age, my boy, those waters are contraindicated. Good night to you, neighbors, he added, moving away from us with that evasive abruptness to which we were accustomed. And then, turning toward us with a physicianly finger raised in warning, he resumed the consultation. No, Balbec, before you're 50. And even then, it must depend on the state of the heart. My father spoke to him of it again, and as often as we met him, and tortured him with questions. But it was labor in vain, like that scholarly swindler who devoted to the fabrication of forged palimpsests labor and knowledge, the 100th part of which would have sufficed to establish him in a more lucrative but honorable occupation. Monsieur Legrandin, had we insisted further, would in the end have constructed a whole ethical landscape and a celestial geography of Lower Normandy sooner than admit to us that his own sister lived within a mile of Balbec, sooner than find himself obliged to offer us a letter of introduction, which would never have been for him such a subject of terror had he been absolutely certain, as from his knowledge of my grandmother's character he really ought to have been certain, that we would never have taken advantage of it.